Hello, everyone. Welcome back to StatTech Research's seminar series on measuring progress and well-being. I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today, we are pleased to welcome Sara MacLennan to the series, who will speak about value for public money and well-being cost-benefit analysis. Before we get started, a brief update on our third annual Measuring Progress workshop, which is taking place this June. Due to the large number of excellent abstracts, we've added a half day and will now begin on the 17th of June and end on the 19th as previously planned. Accepted presenters should have received notification this afternoon. For those interested in following along, there will be room for a small number of in-person attendees. You can check the website in a couple of days for updated registration information. The presentations will also be streamed online. You can follow along there as well. Back to today, Sara will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end. If you have a clarifying question, you can write it in the chat and we can address it. Otherwise, please keep them to the end. At that point, you can raise your virtual hands or post in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. As a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on our website and YouTube channel. Now to introduce Sara MacLennan. Sara is a senior visiting research fellow at London School of Economics, working in the Center for Economic Performance on applying well-being data to the benefit-cost analysis of major government policies. She has advised a range of government departments and bodies on how to include well-being evidence in evaluation and appraisal. Prior to this, Sara spent over 10 years in the UK Government Economic Service, where she authored the official UK guidance for incorporating well-being data into policy appraisal. Sara was also head of evidence at the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, where she worked with leading academics in well-being economics to compile evidence on the determinants of well-being, and where she supported UK government departments and arm's length bodies to incorporate well-being into policy analysis and development. It is a real pleasure to welcome Sara MacLennan. Without further ado, Sara, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I know that I've got 40 minutes, but I'd love to make sure that we've got enough time for discussion. So I am going to try to be a little bit faster because I can see there's a lot of people here with a lot of experience and input from your own areas, and I'd love to make sure that we do have enough time for a bit of a discussion back and forth. I'm going to be talking about wellbeing policy evaluations, about what we know about analysis that can be done to inform the government of where policies may have a better impact for well-being. I will be running through an overview of the Wellbeing Value for Money project. It's a project here at the LSE in the Community Wellbeing Programme of the Centre for Economic Performance. I'll be running through some case studies just to give an example of how it actually works in practice, and I'll be talking through some of the methodological challenges and initial proposed solutions. But first of all, a bit of an overview. Wellbeing value for money, what is it? And I don't think that this quote should be a surprise to anyone here. Imagine you're all fairly signed up to this idea that if we want to be improving people's lives, then we want to be measuring that. And actually what we are then measuring as government, what we are then looking at in our evaluations, what we are then assessing our progress at matters. And this is a quote here by Stiglitz that has been said by many different people. But in short, we want to make sure that we are measuring the right thing. And the focus of our project is saying we want to be making sure that we're measuring well-being. And ultimately, understanding well-being impacts is really important for policy making, because with government, there's a limited amount of money that can be spent. And we then want to be able to understand, hey, where could we make the biggest impact to people's lives? And if we're then measuring things using GDP or other metrics, and we're actually not getting at the heart of how we could most improve people's lives. Often, if we're looking at value for money, it's compared by looking at what the potential costs are of a potential investment, and then you compare it to the monetized benefits. And this is then the basis of cost-benefit analysis. This might be bread and butter to many of you. It might be new to other people. It's this assessment of the monetized costs to the monetized benefits. And in short, if the benefits that we're looking at, if we're including in our cost-benefit analysis, is only then including perhaps cost savings or the monetised value of participants who start employment, then we're potentially missing the actual very focus or the purpose of a potential programme. It might be that a programme is then aiming to improve people's feelings of trust in their neighbourhood. It might be aiming to improve people's feelings of confidence. Some of those people might go on to gain employment. Some of those people may commit less crimes, but some of them may not. And actually, if we're only actually focusing on these aspects which end up with market values, we're missing this whole point. And by including these intermediate steps, the steps to increase trust, the steps to improve confidence, before it then comes to any of these hard outcomes that might be measured, then we're including the full value of our programs. And you can see, in a sense, this diagram here really tipping what might be considered value for money and how you might compare different programs. And this is actually incorporated and endorsed by the UK government when they are looking at cost benefit analysis, or when they're looking at analysis to inform policies. They use this book, which is the Green Book. It says guidance for policy analysis, guidance that's used for understanding cost benefit analysis, but also for how you implement policies, how you set out what the goals are of a policy. And this is set out in this document from the UK Treasury, which says actually, if you're looking at the value of a proposal, you want to be including the benefits, the costs and the risks that affect people's well-being. So they do set this out. It needs to go beyond just market effects. It needs to include all these aspects which are important. And the question is, how do you do that in practice? And there was recent guidance, more recent guidance in 2021, which then set out that you can include well-being. First of all, saying, think about well-being in many different ways. If you're thinking about the objectives, you're thinking about how you're trying to improve people's lives. If you're wanting to then monetize it and include it in cost-benefit analysis, then life satisfaction is this endorsed measure. And a WELLBY is a term that's used. It's this 1 point change in life satisfaction for one person for 1 year, which enables us to, in a sense, include these intermediate changes, include these changes to people's feelings before it might be measured in other market values. And this then helps us to measure what matters, to inform monetization using what people feel rather than just these proxies, such as grades or increased lifetime earnings or moving into employment. It's actually really trying to get a little bit closer at how people actually feel. And the focus is on life satisfaction, mainly because it is a consistent measure. It enables a bit of comparison and enables monetization. It's a lot more possible because there's evidence out there, a lot of evidence which can be used longitudinally through Understanding Society, but also a lot more through ONS, measuring wellbeing programme in the UK. Life satisfaction is absolutely not perfect, and that is one thing to be clear. It is not perfect. It might not be the question which is then, in a sense, recommended in 10 years' time. No one question is perfect, but this consistency means that there can be comparison and a discussion. And we know that actually life satisfaction satisfies the key psychometric properties that we would want from a measure in terms of reliability, validity, sensitivity, and discriminant validity. The other thing to mention is we never say that life satisfaction is the only measure that you should include. It's a great measure to include for being able to monetize the values, but you need to also understand the pathways. And so life satisfaction alone isn't going to enable you to understand all these changes that are happening. And ultimately understand using these further measures alongside is really important. But in short, this is the question for those who are not aware of it. It's overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays on a 0 to 10 scale? That is the question as it is being asked by the ONS, and it's one which has then been chosen to be consistent, to be comparable. It's the same wording that's then asked in the number of Office of National Statistics surveys across the UK. On a 0 to 10 scale, it's asked on a different scale in, for example, Understanding Society, and that is then translated across. The average for the UK population is 7.5. Here's a distribution. This is from the World Wellbeing Movement scales, to then see how this is across the UK population. For adults, about 5% of the whole UK population have got low wellbeing, and that's answering between 0 to 4. And this Value for Money project at the LSE. It's a joint project with the Treasury, the UK Treasury, and the Centre for Economic Performance. And it's in a sense applying this supplementary guidance to a range of different case studies to then look at how does it work in practice? What are some of the challenges? Can you actually look at a whole range of policies from a well-being point of view, or does it actually only suit programs that you would anyway measure through a health lens, such as mental health measures? And the approach is including it in the existing structures of government cost-benefit analysis, rather than going to the point where we're saying we're looking at things absolutely new. We're only going to be measuring everything in terms of well-being, cost effectiveness. We're only measuring things in well-being. It's saying we know that there's an existing structure for cost-benefit analysis. This first step of this program is using this existing structure and making sure that well-being is well incorporated in this existing structure. There are then next steps, and actually in the annex we say, how would this be if you actually turned it around and you measured everything through well-being? But this first step is actually making sure that we're measuring everything so that you can have a real comparison with your benefit cost ratio. And what we do find, and I'll come back to this right at the end, is that the value for money varies dramatically across different policies. There are many policies where actually there's net savings to government. So the government ends up actually saving money through implementing because of the potential future savings in terms of benefit savings or other costs to the NHS, etc. And this difference in the value for money doesn't represent where money is then spent across the UK. And that is what is interesting about this project, to encourage a discussion around where money is being spent and actually where could money be spent. A lot of the analysis suggests a bit more in mental health support, a lot more in active labour market interventions, a lot more in mental health support teams in schools, etc. And that is where there could be greater value for money, and highlighting the areas where perhaps government money isn't actually having as much of an impact on well-being. This is the book. This is a joint book with Richard Layard, Chris Krekel, Isaac Parks, and David Freeman, and it'll be published in 2026, running through the methodology, running through a lot of different policies relating to mental health and employment, and then other areas of policy, education and skills, roads and railways, etc., green space, etc. I'm going to run through 3 example policies, just to give an idea of what this looks like in practice, and then some of the challenges and some of the aspects which have come up through this work. There's 2 different ways that the analysis can be done. One is either directly measuring well-being, and this is where there's an evaluation which has been carried out, and this evaluation assessed life satisfaction, and we're confident in the impact on life satisfaction, and that then means that you can use that to look at what the well-being impact could be of a certain policy, of rolling a certain policy out, for example. And this example here is Healthy Minds, so structured well-being lessons in schools. This is where there are, in a sense, a structured curriculum for social learning in schools. And this is for those aged 11 up to 15. And it's focusing on everything from sex and relationships, healthy living, social media, etc. All these things which are in a sense important for a young person's mental health and development in these years. There was a randomized control trial which was carried out, and it was measured at year 0, year 2, and year 4 of this 4-year program. And the findings from this randomized control trial was that there was no impact on attainment. There was a small reduction in the likelihood of exclusion, specifically for children on free school meals. That was also statistically significant. And there's a direct life satisfaction impact of 0.36 WELLBYs at 2 and 4 years compared to the control group. And there were estimated costs of per pupil per year. And this then can vary depending on whether you're looking at an opportunity cost of the teacher's time. But in a sense, it's pretty small cost per pupil because the main cost was in terms of the training, and then the lessons went across a number of pupils. And what does this mean in terms of the benefit cost ratio? If you carry out this benefit cost ratio, in a sense, in the traditional measures, as it would be done, focusing on attainment, focusing on actually the market costs. The aspects that you can then monetize are the small likelihood in exclusion for those with free school meals, and multiply that by the costs associated with exclusion. This very small reduction with the costs of about 13k associated with exclusion gives you 20p, and the cost per pupil of £23.50 per year. This benefit cost ratio is below zero because these benefits, these market benefits, are really small compared to these costs per pupil. But this completely shifts around if you have a benefit cost ratio where you're including and monetizing well-being. You then, in a sense, look at this change in reported well-being for these young people at these year points. You multiply it by the value of a WELLBY and you divide it by the costs per pupil, which then gives you a benefit cost ratio of around 28, and this depends on the cost that you're using per pupil as a central estimate. If you're using then the low cost estimate of only £23.50 per pupil, then you actually get an even higher, almost a ridiculously high benefit cost ratio. This isn't even including any of the estimates around, well, this high, very high benefit cost ratio is assuming that then there could be long lifetime impacts on a young person, which we don't have from the randomized controlled trial. The central estimate is then, in a sense, being very conservative and saying this is only for those which we have these impacts which we've measured, and kind of taking this central a higher cost per pupil. There could be impacts, lifetime impacts, as we know, kind of with the links of young person up to adult well-being. The second approach is looking at the pathways, looking at a certain policy and how that might impact on other changes where we have evidence of the link to well-being. And this example here is looking at low traffic neighbourhoods. And I'll go forward and then go back again. What we do is we look at the evidence that's linking this policy change to a certain outcome. The evidence of low traffic neighbourhoods and the change in number of people taking up cycling. The evidence in, going back to this graph here, it's not coming up fully clearly, the policy change of low traffic neighbourhoods and the reduction in traffic deaths. The evidence linking low traffic neighbourhoods and crime, neighbourhood interactions, air quality, journey time, etc., congestion, all these changes linking a certain policy and these changes. And then we use the link or the evidence that we have, as much causal evidence as possible, linking this outcome to well-being. And this then, even though the evidence for these first stage comes from past evaluation, this is in a sense an appraisal rather than evaluation of the well-being impact. We can add up all these changes. We can say this is in a sense looking at the monetised well-being impacts. This is in millions of pounds, present value over 10 years. We can add these up, but it's still an estimate of what might happen. These changes in terms of the policy outcome are based on evaluations, but actually how much it impacts on well-being is an appraisal of actually how we think all these things could be added up together. And this is another example where we're again estimating through the pathways. And this is another example which is in the book. This is employment support for mentally ill. And this was an example which was from David Freeman. What we know is employment is a really key element of well-being. I think everyone here will know. Often we look at employment as one of the key aspects that we know. We're really confident in the well-being impacts and actually the negative impact of unemployment and the positive well-being impacts of moving into employment. And the policy that was looked at was individual placement and support programme. And this was where there were tailored job placement and a support, ongoing in-work support for those who are mentally ill. This table here at the bottom shows that actually those who are long-term sick and actually those who are long-term in sense out of the labour market have an even lower well-being than those who are unemployed. And this is the policy that this was directly targeting this group. And what we then do is we estimate through the pathways. There's a number of good evidence programmes which have looked at these active labour market interventions, but they didn't specifically measure well-being. But what we can then see is, based on the evidence that this employment support increases employment rate by 7%, we assume that applies to the UK, and then we can use the figures for what that then means in terms of net income, as well as then the evidence linking employment and life satisfaction of a 0.5 point rise. And this then benefit gives us, in terms of the proportion who are then shifting into employment, and the change, about £4,500 of benefit for moderate cases and 0.7k for severe cases. It costs a lot more for severe patients rather than the moderate patients, because for the severely mentally ill patients, they have long-term ongoing support. It's not, in a sense, stopped after, I think it's 12 months. The support, the in-work support, is stopped for those who are more moderate cases. And so in a sense, the costs are a lot higher. And this table at this side then shows the costs, or in a sense, the net cost to government. For moderate cases, you actually end up with a net saving that minus 285 shows the net saving per individual, because you've got the average treatment costs, but then you've got the savings to benefits and the increased tax receipts over 5 years present value. And so you end up actually with a net saving to government. With the severe cases, there's higher average treatment costs, about 6.5k. You still have these average tax receipts and the benefit savings, but you end up with then a cost to government of about 2.2k per individual. This then means that there's a different, it ends up being a net saving, kind of a no-brainer for moderate cases, a benefit cost ratio of 1.6 for severe cases. So it still is value for money for the government, but not in a sense as strong a case as for moderate cases. And this brings up a second question around, is it not though more valuable to actually be improving well-being of those with a lower starting well-being? This is kind of showing us the benefit cost ratio is lower for those with more severe cases. Then should we be directing our money only at the moderate cases? This then brings us to another one of these challenges. So these are two of the challenges that I've highlighted. There's 3 key challenges or questions that I'm going to talk through according to these cases that I've drawn up. The first thing is that we've got this difference in what we're doing in these case studies. There's economic appraisal, which is an estimate of what might happen or what could happen. And a lot of the evidence is based on that. We've kind of got a certain number of people, we take a certain assumption, and then we've got these potential impacts of this. And evaluation sets out what actually did happen in terms of the change in well-being. And what we often find is, won't come as a surprise, we've got optimism bias. There's this we always assume that things are going to work better than they actually often do. And this is a tricky aspect if you're comparing the benefit cost ratio of a program which is based on assumptions around this might happen and this might, and then we'll add it up to this, compared to a randomized controlled trial of actually what did happen and what were the wellbeing benefits. And the tricky aspect with this is around actually just making sure that you're communicating this clearly. And actually, if you're comparing the benefit cost ratio of these different ways of assessing something, you need to actually be really clear about where that comes from and what is underpinning this with your assumptions, and actually using these findings quite differently. Secondly, part of the challenge, life satisfaction, this endorsed measure by the UK government, can be measured from age 10, giving us stable and valid responses. But there's really important changes to well-being which can happen for those under 10. Are we then just going to exclude the well-being benefits of this group from our cost-benefit analysis? And this, in a sense, completely shifts this whole idea. We're trying to get in this whole impact of experiences into these monetized benefits and costs that we're including. Initial solution, and this is work from Isaac Parks, was around the LSE and it's a proposal that was proposed by Alan Little, who was at the time in the Department for Education, who really raised this around saying this is a big gap. We need to work out a way of how we can then, in a sense, translate measures that are then suitable for young people into a WELLBY. So it's not, in a sense, just forgotten from cost-benefit analysis. And this is the link here. This is, in a sense, an initial start around measures that are already available for young people, including SDQs, Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, also asking happiness yesterday, which has been asked to young people from age 5, and then mapping functions for how you can then map it across to WELLBYs. There will be more work which is done on this. This is a starting point, but at least it means that if there are evaluations which include well-being changes for young people using different measures, then they can in a sense be used in this way. And as I mentioned, there's this challenge around this difference in who gains and who loses. This isn't reflected at the moment in the cost-benefit analysis, and yet we know that there is a societal preference for increasing and improving well-being for those with lower well-being. Partial solutions, three different aspects. First of all, you take the strategic view and you actually say, well, we're going to then focus our solutions on those with lower starting well-being. We know that cost-benefit analysis is anyway just a tool in a sense to help us with allocating resources once we've set out our strategy, and our strategy is trying to improve those with lower well-being, and then in a sense we try to allocate our resources best once we're then focusing on that certain group. The second solution, which goes alongside, they don't have to be and or, is actually setting it really clear what is the starting well-being of the winners and what is the starting well-being of the losers of a certain programme. Or if there's a certain policy, setting out the starting well-being of this group so it can be part of this decision-making process for the policymaker who's then looking at taking these prioritisation decisions. Then potential future solution, could there be something which is quantitative? At the moment there is, and there's text down at the bottom here from the Green Book, for distributional weighting, which is used for welfare, reflecting the fact that actually declining marginal utility, there's greater benefit for those with lower income to have an improvement in income than those with higher income. That's already reflected in the Green Book for welfare, for income. Could this also be included for well-being, a kind of certain distributional weighting related to the societal preferences for this? And actually, there is some initial analysis which could be used for this. So some preliminary analysis from Laird and Ocarina, also some analysis from Cooper et al. Bottom study has been published. Top study is just preliminary. But actually showing that actually a UK respondent values this improvement of well-being kind of twice as much if it's going from 2 to 3 than an improvement from 9 to 10. So really we have quite strong societal preferences for improving well-being of those at the bottom end and at the top, and we can quantify this. Also, this study is taking a different methodological approach, has slightly different figures, but also shows similar in a sense scale of having a really quite higher preference for improving those with lower well-being than those at the top well-being. And these are figures that could perhaps be then added on as a second quantitative solution to address these differences in focusing on those with lower well-being. And so the next steps, the Wellbeing Value for Money book is coming out this year in 2026. There will also be an update to the Wellbeing Supplementary Guidance, this guidance which was published in 2021, reflecting a lot of the changes to evidence that has come out in the last years, including case studies of how this has been applied in government, but also reflecting a lot of these questions around distributional analysis, double counting, WELLBY, all these methodological questions which have been raised. And actually there's training which is ongoing for those in government around how they can then be using wellbeing evidence and using that to inform some of their decisions. So conclusion, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a huge difference in the wellbeing value for money, how much a pound of spend can make a difference to wellbeing. And there's policies right at the top here, including mental health support teams in schools, active labour market interventions, etc., which actually are net savings. So in a sense, it's a bit of a no-brainer. They're beyond this in terms of the benefit cost ratio. They end up having a saving to government. I suppose the key aspects, the two key messages are assessing these wellbeing impacts of policies allows us to assess this cost-benefit analysis, including these otherwise non-monetised aspects, and to really understand where government spending can have this greatest impact. And the current spending doesn't actually necessarily reflect where there could be the greatest impact to wellbeing based on what we know. And that is the end. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everyone's faces. And hopefully, hoping if I press here that will stop sharing rather than me exiting the meeting.
Thank you, Sara.
Oh no, it's leaving the meeting. I'm not actually sure how I
For
stop
those of
sharing.
you who have questions, Mark, you can go first, and everyone else, please feel free to raise your hand or to write in the chat.
Have I
And
stopped sharing now?
you haven't yet, Sara, although we can always reflect back on your slides, and we can see each other across the top. So if it's causing a challenge, I wouldn't worry about it.
Stop sharing, found it, and the button.
There we go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Cool.
Mark, feel free.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Hi.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. That was a great talk. I'm very happy this stuff's ongoing. I have two questions. So one kind of technical and then one a bit more about the policymaking environment.
Yeah.
So on the technical question is, I guess we have this work emerging. I'm doing some of it. Anthony Lepinter's in the call doing some of it on like measurement problems with life satisfaction, I guess. And we know that cost benefit analysis is very sensitive to it. Now, I think the income and prices cost benefit analysis is also like a wild mess of cooked stuff. So it's not that I have any concerns. It's more that I'm curious about what you think is domains where this WELLBY's analysis is liable to be like relatively straightforward, like better than the status quo. We should just proceed there. And whether there are other domains where you think there's more to be like a bit worried about. Maybe we shouldn't go there yet. And then because of these measurement issues. And then my second question is about the wider policymaking landscape. So coming to the UK from Australia, I've been really struck by how obsessed the UK is with value for money analysis and how dominant the Treasury's Green Book is as a policymaking tool. And increasingly my perspective is that, and this is like something that I get from the wider policy studies community in the UK, is that this kind of dominance of Treasury logics is part of what's broken in the UK. Like that's why we can't fix stuff. And so I'm curious again, like, what are we just perpetuating that Treasury logic in a new form here? And are there places where you think that would still be like very much a big benefit on the status quo? And are there other domains, like I'm thinking of things like complex needs, for example, or social cohesion, where actually just like this whole kind of linear randomized controlled trial cost benefit analyzer paradigm is not so helpful. Like it's just not very suitable to what we're doing. Anyway, thank you.
Super. Thanks. Well, great questions. I think the first aspect, there are measurement challenges. As I said, high satisfaction is absolutely not the perfect measure. And I think no one single measure will ever be perfect, and we shouldn't ever, in a sense, and I don't think anyone will forget that there needs to be always kind of continually questioning that. But I think I would say that making sure that we are, in a sense, including these aspects which would otherwise be non-monetized is a step forward. And the work, in a sense, the group that in a sense started a lot of the work was called the Social Impacts Task Force, and it started off as a group, and it was chaired by Amanda Rowlett, who was the chief economist of the Department for Transport, with the concern that actually there were a lot of social impacts that just weren't being quantified in cost benefit analysis, because it was a lot more easy to quantify the GBA impacts and quantify the things where you could actually see things in market. And so I think my view is the wellbeing impacts are absolutely imperfect. The figure that we arrived at for how you can monetize it is absolutely imperfect. It's linked up to the value of a QALY, which was completely imperfect. All these things are imperfect, but the one thing that it does do is it makes sure that a lot of these social impacts, which would otherwise be forgotten about, are not included or put in kind of a paragraph down below because they're not monetized, are coming up into the part of the box which is talking about list your monetized benefits, and then in the sense it kind of gives a description of them. And I think that is always going to be an improvement around thinking about actually what are these full key areas. And so I would say across the piece there are there is a lot of potential for that, and I think actually there's a lot of departments who are already doing this actually really well, and there's less of a concerned for that. If actually especially if a lot of their focus of their policy making is trying to change these complex needs, and they're more trying to look at that. I think the second question around this, the Treasury logic, there were the reviews to the Green Book, which was in a sense aiming to get at that, answer that concern in a sense that there was too much a focus on this benefit cost ratio for allocating money. And the response from the Treasury was in a sense saying, not really. And I think there's two different aspects to this, but the review of the Green Book was trying to make it a lot clearer that in a sense the decisions or the direction of where money is going is then focused on, in a sense, strategies. What is this democratically elected government aiming to do? In the sense, I think the words of the current government, it's around missions, it's around what did they set out and say that they're trying to do. And then cost benefit analysis is underpinning that to say, if this is our aim, how can we then do that in the most cost effective way? I still think that there's challenges with that, especially in the way that cost benefit analysis could be done around various different methods, depending on where you're in the country, depending on income levels, there's many different challenges. But I would say it's, in the sense, the benefit cost ratio informs allocation of some projects less than, and I think people imagine. I think a lot more is based on, in a sense, does this meet the strategic objectives? Does this meet with what we're trying to achieve? And then the benefit cost ratio often informs more around how do we want to do this? Strategic focus is around we want to reduce congestion around Manchester. The benefit cost ratio is used. Do we go to the west or the east, or under the tunnel, or a bridge over the top? And it's then, in a sense, understanding how you might, what are these various different options? And so, in a sense, I would say it's not quite as much as people would argue it is underpinning a lot of these decisions. Other people would say it should, Richard Laird would say this should actually underpin decisions a lot more. And I think that then comes more at the strategic case around who are you trying to focus at? In a sense, this work that we're doing, I think, should more be trying to support government to say, these are the types of things that could improve people's lives more. These are the types of groups who actually could benefit a lot more. And I think that's more where a lot of this work could inform decision making. Thank you for the question, and do feel free to follow up. It's really, I always value your views and your reflections on a lot of these aspects.
Francesco?
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. I actually have more of a clarification question related to one of the estimates you showed for the low traffic neighborhoods. If I understand correctly, what you have in the bar chart is the valuation of the benefits in monetary terms that you would get from introducing an LTN in a number of domains, which would be, I don't know, savings from less losses of dear ones, etc., etc. The question is, how do you decide which are the possible direct and indirect components that should enter into that computation?
Super question. Based on where the evidence is, I think the first step is a theory of change around what do we know around this policy, and then various different pathways that could link to well-being. Thinking about the different domains that are important for well-being, where is the evidence, and then, in a sense, looking for where there could be evidence, and then in a sense filling that up. And where there is a lack of evidence, then having a space, or saying this is where there could be a pathway but we don't have any evidence, or in a sense having that as zero. But in a sense, this theory of change, which often is done in government anyway to inform a policy, this is what we want to achieve. This is kind of the various different pathways, so basing it on that existing theory of change, and then where there is evidence. So for this, for the various different aspects which I showed for low traffic neighbourhoods, those ones here were all just those where there had been evidence from evaluations around how low traffic neighbourhoods had impacted on active travel, traffic deaths, neighbourhood interactions, etc., crime. So these were, in a sense, only where there had been evaluation evidence on these domains.
Thanks a lot. That's very helpful.
Thanks, Sarah. And Francesco and Mark, I didn't thank earlier. We have a question in the chat from Brandon Sharman, following up on Mark's question. If you were writing an evaluation or other policy, how would you convey using the combination of tools to best measure value for money? Or how would you balance the strengths of each tool or use them to minimize the weaknesses of each other?
And so this is for the start bit. The question was an evaluation, or I'm just trying to.
Yeah, so I'd say it slightly differently. So if you're making a recommendation to the government and you want them to evaluate the policy, and you recognize very clearly that each tool has its relative strengths and weaknesses, what's the best approach to undertaking this analysis?
And the tool in terms of standard cost-benefit analysis or well-being analysis?
Or maybe a deliberative process that's not quantitative.
Yeah, I think there is, I would say that there's a lot of, it kind of, in a sense, it depends a bit on the policies which are out there. But I think what you have in government is very rarely a cost-benefit analysis informing a decision. There's almost always a cost-benefit analysis as one bit of information to then be part of a stakeholder engagement, a stakeholder process, and various different steps to then take a final decision. I would say that this well-being value for money analysis can be really helpful because it can highlight to people things that they otherwise wouldn't think, or they might be surprised about where there is evidence. I think one example with the low traffic neighbourhoods, people were quite surprised, oh, that there's evidence linking this. Oh, there's evidence linking that. Because there, and I think at the same time, there's also evidence that people were very angry and annoyed about these, and that's also an experience which is there. But I think this wellbeing cost-benefit analysis can then, in a sense, help people highlight what evidence is there to help them make their decisions, because otherwise some of their inputs to a lot of the stakeholder consultation can be then, in a sense, informed by not necessarily informed by evidence. So I think that can help, but I don't think that a decision should. My view is that decisions should never just be made based on cost-benefit analysis, which it never is in government. It's actually always done with deliberative processes, and I think that is reflective of, because it's important. We need to understand for policy to be successful. It's this whole aspects around where it's not just about what will be the impacts of a policy. A policy will only have these certain impacts if it's actually accepted by people, and if people actually feel ownership, and it's going to actually get the impacts and the aims that they're trying to have it. And for that, you need to understand where people are at, how it's going to impact them in their real lives, rather than this kind of evidence of what's going to happen in an RCT. That actually needs to be reflected in what people experience themselves and lots of different groups, rather than just kind of these average impacts across the population. So in a sense, maybe I was too long in government, but I do actually think that the process that often, well, the process which is there, sometimes it's cut short, sometimes not followed in through, but kind of the ideal process in terms of analysis to underpin a lot of the thoughts, plus a lot of stakeholder engagement, plus a lot of kind of deliberative discussion. I think actually, and having both of them to get to the final decision, I would say that balance is important.
Great, thanks. Yeah, you got two nice positive responses from Brandon. Natalia asked the question in the chat, and then Andrea, you can go next. How do we account for the persistence of well-being effects which are uncertain, and how are well-being spillovers typically included? And if I may, I'll add, with the well-being effects that happen in the future, maybe you would use a discount rate, or maybe not. How do you account for that?
Super question. So the main approach, which is often taken for the analysis, is to be conservative and say, if we've only got evidence for 2 years, then we just assume that well-being lasts for those 2 years. But then depending on the type of change and what we know about adaptation or length of time of impacts, we can then say, but hey, we could assume that actually it would last for longer based on what we are aware of. But the kind of the starting assumption, I would say, is often very conservative around this is where we have the evidence for how long it would last for. And it's more in kind of these scenarios that we then set out, we could assume that this would last for longer. Or as I kind of briefly mentioned with the healthy minds, this evidence around we know the impact on child well-being or adolescent well-being and the link to later adult well-being, that can then in a sense be applied using the findings from Origins of Happiness, as Clark et al, and they then in a sense show those links going through. And I think that should always be highlighted because well-being is a lifetime change, and changes in childhood do then have these longer term impacts on our lives, but in a sense included in a certain scenario to include it through. Spillovers is actually going to be something else which is included in the update to the Green Book guidance, around a bit clearer how you can then incorporate that, because there is quite a bit of evidence from writers, many others, around kind of the spillover impacts on, for example, a partner of various different changes to well-being. And we are going to have some advice around, okay, setting out what evidence is there, what can be used, how can you then apply that to various different groups. You may have noticed, the beady-eyed of you, that actually low traffic neighbourhoods, one of the wellbeing impacts was on widowers, and that was in a sense this linking to the number of traffic deaths and then the change there. I would say that's less of a, it's kind of a question about whether that's a spillover, actually an impact on the person's life themselves, but you can also then look at that for unemployment and other impacts. The challenge is that there's, in a sense, you end up then multiplying and multiplying and multiplying through to the point where actually some of your impacts could become meaningless, because you then get into a second order and a third order and an ongoing impact that then, especially if you, unless you actually know that it's not an evaluation, you're just kind of assuming how these impacts could go through, and so it tends to be then applied with a bit of caution, or in a second scenario. Discounting is really important. The Green Book always discounts impacts in the future. For financial values, they discount it at 3.5%, reflecting time preference, also catastrophic risk. And this is then only 1.5% for wellbeing impacts, because there's a 2%, which is also included in the 3.5%, which is for the assumption that there's ongoing growth in the declining marginal utility of income. But to cut it short, 1.5% is then the discounted rate for wellbeing impacts in the future.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Andrea, please feel free.
Yeah. Hi, Sara. Thanks for the talk. I have a couple of questions around optimism bias. The first one is whether you're aware of any research that has looked at sort of the extent of optimism bias within WELLBY assessments. So, for instance, looking at an appraisal and then an evaluation of the same program. And I guess the second question is more probably practical in terms of what suggestions would you give in the context of appraisal of using WELLBYs in order to avoid optimism bias?
Super question. Wellbeing hasn't been, I would say, it's the kind of the big in the last number of years where it's been included a lot in appraisal, and so I think that analysis will be really interesting in the coming years when there's enough evaluations that you can then compare to the appraisals. And I think there's not quite enough out there to be able to do that comparison. One thing though that could be looked at is a program which then said we are going to hit this many people, and then you don't need the wellbeing for that. If it then only hit half of the people who they thought that they were going to hit, then in a sense you would have half the potential wellbeing benefit. But I think what we don't yet have is enough of this, what to be based on these kind of following the pathways to an impact on wellbeing. How does that compare to actually this evaluation on wellbeing? Because that's what I think will be really interesting, comparing the two approaches, and there isn't quite enough of that out there yet. And the practical steps, there is Green Book guidance for optimism bias, but it's mainly focused on IT projects and I think infrastructure projects. And that I think often tends to just be used as a bit of a rule of thumb in the absence of any better evidence. But that was, at the time, it was a review of, based on all these projects and how much they thought it was going to completely revolutionize things, how much did it lead to an impact. And so I think IT is always the absolute worst. And so I always use a bit lower of an optimism bias than is applied to IT. But it's out there. It's the Her Majesty's Treasury Green Book guidance, and its optimism bias is the guidance around there that can be applied.
Sara, I have a couple of questions, I think, that just clarify things a little bit. For the Green Book, is this intended to be used for, basically all new budgetary items? And then where do they draw the line on, let's say, existing budgetary items? So when is this used? And let me provide a little context for my own curiosity. We're looking at different countries around the world that are using well-being in budgeting. And some governments are suggesting it for, let's say, policy appraisal, and others have tried to go further than that to evaluate, let's say, existing budget items.
Yeah.
So can you tell us where the Green Book is supposed to be used?
Yeah, super question. So the Green Book is used for regulation and spending. So if you have a new regulation, then that is also where you'd apply the Green Book to say what are the costs and the benefits of this. And also for spending. Interestingly, in the UK, it's a legal requirement to publish your regulatory impact assessment. So it's really easy to see those publicly. It's not at the moment, it's just been started that then business cases will start to be published in the UK. But up until now, it wasn't then mandatory to publish them. And so that means it's a lot easier to then, in a sense, publicly follow impact assessments than those for spending. And it depends on the requirements, and what they have is a spending review every certain number of years, every kind of 3 to 5 years. And if it's a zero-based spending review, then that means going back to starting from zero. And that means also assess the value for money of all of your aspects and what you are then, in a sense, spending. The focus tends to be more on capital, though, rather than resource spends. And there's other spending reviews which are more around, okay, additional spend. What would you then be, what additional bit of spending would you be looking at? And so it tends to be, the majority is around, this is a new spending proposal, this is a new programme, what is the value for money of that? And it's rarer that you actually go back to looking at what are we already spending our money and where's the focus. But it does happen, but as I said, mainly for capital spend.
And there's a lot of history here. So the Green Book goes back so quite some time, and I guess it's become more sophisticated. So the quality, but also the crime. So in these impact assessments, for example, or any of the other examples, business cases, are people taking up the well-being, life satisfaction aspect? And maybe you can give us some examples of real-world uses.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a Wellbeing Analysis Board in the UK government, and so that is then across government departments, and it's the representative, in a sense, who is in charge of, or kind of being a bit of a champion for wellbeing analysis in the department, and they share quite a few examples. The tricky thing, as I said, is business cases not being published, but there are many out there. Regulatory impact assessment for, I think, visiting care restrictions in nursing homes, they use the WELLBY, and there's a number of discussions that I've had with departments who are using it in their non-published business cases, because it is, in a sense, impacts that otherwise weren't incorporated. And I think what is important, though, is where there's one bit of a department who is including well-being in their assessments, it then means that there needs to be a bit of a shift across the whole of a department to then make sure that they're including well-being. And that's what's happening in a number of departments, thinking about, okay, how can we then apply this across the piece so that we're not, in a sense, just then having the benefit cost ratio, the analysis of this certain area being completely different just because they're including wellbeing and the rest of us aren't. But that shift is definitely happening in government, and hopefully as business cases become more published, then that'll be something we'll see more and more.
And I imagine that some of the impacts are cross-cutting. So you have one department affecting another department. Is that being accounted for in any way?
Absolutely. If you are building a road and you have an impact on the environment or health or community, then that needs to be incorporated in a Department for Transport business case, and in a sense, then they monetize that in their cost benefit analysis. And there are often a lot of kind of cross-governmental meetings where there are things which cross the cost, but in a sense, they, even though the impacts aren't just within on transport, they include all these kind of cross-governmental questions. And there's analysts who come together to make sure that the way that they're appraising health, the way that they're appraising the environment, are in a sense consistent across government, because they're using this Green Book methodology.
That's great. So if you know, I am building a road and there's savings in some other department, that savings is still monetized, or those benefits are still accounted, even if it's recognized by another department. It seems like some of the guidance from, I think, the Center for Policy Development, I can just mention them, for example, out of Australia. They talk about a whole of government approach to using well-being in government decision-making, which makes a lot of sense to me. But it's part of the reason is for internalizing these costs and benefits across departments. But it sounds like that's happening to a degree, at least.
Yeah, so to be really clear, when I was talking about impacts on health and impacts on the environment, I wasn't meaning around impacts to the Department for Health or the Department for the Environment. So thank you for the clarification question. That was more if there's impacts on air quality or noise quality, that is then quantified. In terms of those savings, they are, I would say, estimated, looked at, but I think they tend to be, in a sense, distance. There's not the same incentive if it's then outside of your own department. So I'd say that challenge is also there. It's why there have been a number of kind of cross-cutting groups that have been set up. There was the Work Health Unit, which was set up linking together Department for Health and Department for Work and Pensions, because those were two areas around getting people back into work and addressing long-term illnesses, where they realised that, hang on, doing these in separate departments is just not ending up with the best outcome. We need to be kind of linking up together, linking up our evidence, linking up our incentives to make sure that we're working well together. And so it's definitely not kind of a whole government approach, I would say. I would say a lot of those challenges are there. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, thank you. So we're hitting time now, and I don't see any other questions. Unless we see anything pop up. I think, Sara, if you have any closing words for us, I'd say first, thank you very much for the insightful insight into what's going on in the UK government and the use of well-being in cost-benefit analysis.
Thanks for all the great questions, and thanks for being here. Get in touch if you've got any follow-up questions. I'm always really interested in ongoing discussions and questions and critiques. So please do get in touch. I think the work only gets better through critique and discussion. So please do.
Great. Thank you again. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.